A very different sort of Singapore today, with FP3 being held in the wet. Fabulous to see the cars sliding around. Well, if you're from the outside anyway, fabulous to watch the cars sliding around. I'm sure it wasn't that much fun in the cockpit, although most of the drivers said there was quite a lot of grip on the circuit when it was wet. The only drama, of course, is the inevitable standing water, and then going from the dry patches under the tunnel to the wet track again. So it all made it quite interesting. Really good lap by Charles Leclerc, who came out this morning, as ever, as he often has done this year, a completely different driver, really, to the one we saw on Friday, which is only natural, really, if you're a great driver, because Friday is all about having a moment here, perhaps getting the car sorted and spending a bit more time in the garage than you would normally do. And that's what Charles does really well. Comes back on a Saturday with a setup that works for him, and was just really quick all day. I mean, yesterday, Carlos Sainz looked very fluid and very balanced in the Ferrari. Today, it was all Charles Leclerc, and Carlos playing the sort of very nice second backup role, but it was Charles Leclerc who looked dynamite, really, all day, I thought. Really good lap. Q3 was all about getting out on slicks, getting the tyres up to temperature, and then obviously finding a quick lap as the circuit got faster and faster, and Charles did that really well. Ferrari made no tactical or strategy dramas, although their switch to slicks for Charles was very last minute compared with Mercedes or Red Bull, but Charles went right out and was just really good virtually from lap one, by which point P1 was Yuki Tsunoda in the AlphaTauri, the only driver to go out the back end of qualifying in Q3 on a set of intermediates. That's what everyone had basically run in Q2, apart from the rabbits at the back who were looking maybe to take a gamble, like Aston Martin, for example, to put on slicks just to see whether they might work and magically get them into Q3. But that didn't happen. So Yuki was quickest for, I don't know, a minute or so in Q3. But then the soft tyres, the soft slicks came into their own. They got up to temperature. And Fernando Alonso at one point, really quick. And he finished, I'm getting ahead of myself, but he finished P5, really good lap by Fernando in the Alpine. But it was Charles Leclerc who was quickest in the end, helped by a Red Bull mess for Max Verstappen. Basically, simple terms, ran out of fuel. And in order to obviously get through scrutineering with some fuel in the car, they had to abort his last lap, which didn't look like a great lap anyway. It wasn't purple. And so Max had came in, was irate, of course. And so here's the verdict on that. Max did no more than most of the people in terms of laps, most of the drivers in Q3, 7 laps. Indeed, Sergio Perez did 8 laps. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Sergio would have used more fuel and therefore they had more fuel in Perez's car. What it means is that Max did a number of laps, probably at least 3, in which he was really quick and then aborted the lap. And so that uses up quite a lot of fuel. It's quite a long lap as well. But end of the day, they're obviously playing with very fine margins, and that is what Red Bull do, isn't it? That's when I often say a Red Bull best team in racing. I guess what I mean is they're really good at knowing what calls to make right on the edge, and sometimes it's going to go wrong. I was thinking this morning actually about the way Max could have won the Hungarian Grand Prix 2 years ago when they put him on intermediates at the restart after that first corner shunt instead of slicks, and he could have won that race from the midfield or the 2/3 of the way through the grid, wherever he was, if they'd put him on slick. So I was thinking to myself, well, Red Bull are not infallible. They're a great race team. They're not infallible. And we saw that again today. A simple, ultimate reason for Max not being on the front row, if you like, I'm not sure he would have got the pole, was that they ran him out of fuel. Or he ran himself out of fuel, perhaps. Slightly different. I don't think it was that. I think it was they were right on the edge, and Max did a number of laps, quick laps, that ended up using a lot more fuel than anybody else in Q3. And probably they were running pretty tight on margin anyway. And don't forget, they would have different amounts of fuel in the Perez and Verstappen cars anyway, because they're slightly different. And that's the margin to which they put fuel in the car. They're different in the way they use the throttle, and Max presumably has a little bit more open throttle than Sergio. So I think it was that. Should we be tough on Red Bull and say they really messed it up? I don't think so. I mean, we love saying that, not only me, but a lot of people we love saying Red Bull are a great race team. And what we saw today is a great race team right on the edge, and they got it slightly wrong with Max. What it'll do, of course, is make it a pretty interesting race because he's starting, what is it, P8 on a circuit in which it's quite difficult to overtake. Probably one-stop strategy if it's dry, but he's got a quick car, no doubt about that. So Charles Leclerc then had, as it turned out, he didn't know it at the time, had no Max Verstappen to have to beat to the front row. But he did have a Red Bull to have to beat to the front row. And it was unbelievably close. It was Sergio Perez, who was really quick at Monaco. As I've been saying on these videos for a long time now, it's all about Sergio's ability to get the power down out of slow corners and how he does that beautifully. And I think what we saw today at Marina Bay in Singapore was a perfect storm for Sergio Perez, because the grip was changing as the circuit was evolving, as it was drying out. But on top of that, some corners had a greasier exit near the curb than others. And if that's the case, what you need is a guy with Perez's right foot. And he was absolutely superb. I think that was the most underrated performance of qualifying today, actually, was Checo's P2. And if you look at the times, Charles Leclerc, 49.412. Sergio Perez, 49.434. And for that matter, Lewis Hamilton, 49.466. We'll get on to Lewis in a second. I just don't want to brush over Sergio Perez and say, oh, Red Bull, front row. I thought that was a really, really good performance from Sergio. And for sure, the car was light. As we've been saying, they're not going to play around with fuel, are they? They're not going to have too much fuel in a Red Bull, that's for sure. But Sergio got it absolutely perfectly. And I think all credit to him. All credit to him for doing that time. And I did say, was it on a live stream? Yeah, I think it was on a live stream at least a week ago. Somebody said, oh, what are your predictions for Singapore, Peter? And I said, well, I thought Sergio was due for another win, particularly as everybody's been saying recently, what are Red Bull doing with Sergio? Should they replace him? And are they trying stuff with him that for next year and all this stuff? No, he's just been going through his usual slump, and he's not that good on medium fast circuits anyway. This is what he's good at, and this is what we saw today. So full marks to Sergio Perez, I say, to Sergio Perez. Lewis Hamilton, wow. So many times he was out there stringing purples together. Quickest out of the box, really. And he was quickest in FP1 yesterday and quickest in qualifying for a long time in all three sessions. He was brilliant. Just looking as if he was really enjoying his driving again. I think with these conditions, obviously there was less bouncing because there's less grip, less downforce, less everything. So all of a sudden Lewis Hamilton was driving a race car again, and you could just see it in his body language. It was the Lewis Hamilton of 2021 against Max Verstappen for a long time. And Lewis didn't get the pole, but he failed by a ridiculously small margin. Let's look at it again. Charles Leclerc, 49.412. Lewis Hamilton, 49.466. Over a 1 minute, 49 second lap, which is a long lap. And there's a lot of corners there. And that's how close they were. So Lewis, just a little bit more, would have been on the pole. And no surprise, I think, in terms of what we were saying yesterday, build up to Singapore. Obviously, the Mercedes was going to have, there are fewer things at Marina Bay that are going to show up the faults on the Mercedes. So it was going to be closer, and that's what's happened. And then if you throw in the rain factor and right at the end, the track being still a little bit damp, then you've got Mercedes right there, which is good to see. Interesting there to see Perez did 8 laps, Lewis 8 laps, and Max 7 laps, just to reiterate the point. 8 laps, of which probably 4 were mega slow, whereas in Max's case, 7 laps, of which only probably 2 were mega slow. And the rest of them were Max quick, except he kept coming out of it. So anyway, we'll get on to Max in a second. Carlos Sainz P4, a classic Carlos Sainz result, really. Very good yesterday. Lots of flair, lots of promise. But when it really came down to putting it on the line, he has this margin that he has to build into his driving because he's a bit spikier. And you saw it, there's a change of direction, quite a slow speed change of direction, probably third gear. You see it from the rear on the camera shot. And you see Carlos going, and Charles is doing like that, much more linear. And that is where the time is. And that is what Charles does so well. And it's not because he's using a different line. It's all to do with, as Rob would say, it's all to do with the inputs he's putting into the steering and the throttle at that moment and the balance he's got in the car. And he's not asking too much of the car, whereas Carlos classically wants to get on top of the car. And that when you get down to the last minute of Q3, that's what makes the difference. It doesn't make the difference in FP1 or FP2 on a Friday because not many other people are doing what Carlos just does naturally. And so, yeah, P4, obviously in strong position in terms of the Ferrari being a good car, and it's a nice position for Charles to have Carlos in P4 tomorrow. Fifth, Fernando Alonso. He was really quick as well. Quickest at one point in Q3. And we were saying yesterday the new floor on the Alpine really seems to be working well. And Fernando, for the same reason that Lewis and Mercedes almost there, I think Fernando able to get a lot out of that car because they didn't have to worry about bouncing. They just get the car to be a nice race car with the sort of changeable conditions and the grease on the exit of the track. So fabulous lap from Fernando Alonso. P5. Think about that. P5 for Fernando Alonso in an Alpine around Singapore. Really, really good. And Lando Norris, again, another star, I think. P6, but 0.6 away from Fernando. Interesting margin. Both of them running new floors, new aero on that car, and both the cars are better for sure. But Lando, 0.6 slower than Fernando around Singapore, but P5. Alpine at the moment doing the better job. Next I thought was an heroic lap by Pierre Gasly in the very difficult AlphaTauri. But having said that, as soon as we got to the wet today, as we've been saying, all of a sudden the bouncing went out of the car. They could run it a little bit softer, and Pierre Gasly had a race car, and he was really quick this morning when they were all out on wets. Really quick in the top 3 or 4 all the time. As the track dried, he went to intermediates. He faded away a bit, but really good. I thought P7. There's no way in the world you're going to get anyone to get more out of that AlphaTauri than we saw with Pierre today. And he did have a couple of mishaps, I think, but very good performance. And then Max P8, would you believe? So let's think about Max and what happened there in P8. We know he ran out of fuel, and maybe he would have had a front row lap right at the end there. But the point is, he was making mistakes that Sergio Perez wasn't making, and he was doing quite a lot of this. Great car control. I say car control, it was just beautiful balance whenever the back end went away, and he was doing it in a really nice linear way. But that's what Sergio wasn't doing with the car. And Sergio was getting his time just by perfect throttle application and not coming into the corner as early as Max, and just keeping it absolutely clean. Whereas Max, I think, partly because of what happened at Monaco with Sergio, I think he was thinking, I've got this sussed, and the pole is there. But every lap he did, there was a slight glitch, and he came out of the throttle a few times to start it again, and that's what in the end cost it and put him short of fuel. So an imperfect day for Max Verstappen, and he will put this down again to what happened at Monaco and another learning curve. I don't think he'll just say, that was a terrible day and not think about it anymore. I think this will mean something to Max, regardless of how well his season's been going. I think it will mean something to him. And be interesting to see what he does tomorrow from P8 on the grid, won't it? He's got some interesting people behind him as well. Kevin Magnussen, good job in the Haas to get into Q3. Very good racing driver, Kevin. Very good fast driver, Kevin Magnussen. And a good lap in difficult conditions. That's kind of what you expect from Kevin Magnussen. And look at that. Max Verstappen 51.3, Kevin Magnussen in the Haas 51.5. Impressive. And then Yuki Tsunoda, who started on the intermediates, ended up on the slicks, P10. So really good job by him. So George Russell didn't get through into Q3, which he will find incredibly annoying. And that was because he had a problem with the throttle sensor, and it wasn't shutting. And then he was finding himself in sort of neutral and weird things. Bit like Charles Leclerc during the Austrian Grand Prix. Charles still won the race from memory. But George had issues with that. And anyway, he seemed to be having issues with the circuit. There were quite a lot of George's going straight on, spin turn, rejoin. Probably today some of that was sensor related, but quite a lot of that yesterday as well. So George will not be happy at starting P11, just behind Yuki Tsunoda. Watch out, run for cover. Lance Stroll behind him. He was okay, did a pretty good job. Went round and round. But a big surprise for me was Esteban Ocon not getting out of Q1. And he if you please, glazed the discs on the Alpine by doing 2 slow laps, trying to get the intermediates up to temperature, and just glazed the disc. You don't hear about that happening very often in Formula One. It's the sort of thing that happens on the way to Formula One, but he's pretty open about it. Didn't get them up to temperature correctly, and then glazed them. So that was that, and then the car was pulling massively after that. So. A difficult day for him as well, obviously, with the Pierre Gasly announcement. Also, probably, I don't think for Esteban's point of view, it's a great thing for Pierre Gasly to be coming to Alpine. 2 Frenchmen, I'm not sure they get on that well anyway. I think he would much prefer to have had Fernando, but anyway, it's going to be Pierre Gasly, and looks like Nick de Vries, as we're saying, going to AlphaTauri. One other thing that happened today that was a bit odd, I thought, was that they started this thing about the jewellery again with Lewis, and why he'd failed to return or incorrectly returned a self-scrutineering thing, which is to do with, are you wearing any jewellery? And he was, because when he tried to take the nose thing out, whatever it is, it got infected. And so the only way long-term, turns out, to get it to work was to put it back in and let it heal and then get it out, which obviously he hadn't explained to anyone, I guess, and the team relying on him to fill in the form, and he did have it in, and he got fined €25,000 for his trouble, which I think is a bit over the top myself. I put that down alongside a rule which allows drivers like Nicholas Latifi and Nikita Mazepin into Formula One. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with those 2, but they're not the greatest racing drivers in the world. And Colton Herta not allowed in. I mean, there are a lot of weird things going on at the moment, which I'm surprised by, actually. And I wouldn't have thought this was a great thing to have this thing going on with Lewis as well. And I can't imagine that okay, €25,000 is probably not very much to Lewis Hamilton or Mercedes for that matter. But it's just a slightly odd thing to happen just before qualifying, really, I thought. From a point of view of Formula One's image, point 1. And point 2, there's quite a lot of argy-bargy going on now about the cost cap. Surprise, surprise. Regular viewers of this channel will know how sceptical I've been about cost caps from day one, because A, I don't think they're ever forensically enforceable, and B, I think the number of loopholes that are out there, whether it be the three highest paid salary guys or marketing or engines or whatever it is, what does it all add up to? Anyway, there's been a bit of a war of words going on between Toto Wolff and Christian Horner about all this. And I suspect, this is just me being cynical now, but I suspect that after the August break, when it was clear that Mercedes believed that Red Bull were running flexi floors and all the rest of it, and they would be really hurt by the technical directive, and it was pretty clear that they hadn't been doing any of that, and they weren't hurt by the technical directive, and they're even quicker now because the margin was even greater. I think, gave up on that one. Let's start on another one, which is that Red Bull must be spending money over the budget cap, and we'll focus on that. I would say, if I had to guess, I'd say all the top teams are spending over the budget cap, but that's just me. And I think what they're going to do about that and how they actually police this whole budget cap thing, I suppose that's what this will do, bring it into focus. But it's a bit, I don't know what it is. It's a bit over political, I think. But classic Formula One, I suppose everybody loves that sort of chat and that sort of storyline, don't they? It's what kind of what it's all about. So, yeah, can Charles Leclerc win the Singapore Grand Prix from the pole? Will it be Sergio Perez, who has the better car over a race distance, can do a better job with the tyre management and will win the race that way? Will it be Lewis, potentially winning his first Grand Prix of the season, Mercedes' first Grand Prix of the season? He's got half a chance. And whether or not the Mercedes is going to be as good as a Red Bull or a Ferrari over a race distance, or even better, remains to be seen. But it'll be interesting. Fernando Alonso also could be in very good shape tomorrow, certainly for a podium finish, I would have thought. So, yeah, an interesting day at the races, as they say. It's now, 12:15. It feels like about 6 o'clock in the evening. I just got back from the track. But it's 12:15 in Singapore. The whole half the city is shut down. The other half is one raging party. But more than anything, it's probably time to finish this video and get it out to you guys. See you tomorrow.